Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the Chief Executive of Conservative Home, and I'm hosting this week's conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. We're here in Jacob's office in the Treasury building. Jacob, how are you?
I'm extremely well, thank you. I hope you're well too.
Very well, thank you. I imagine you're very busy.
Well, there's quite a lot going on. The government as a whole is busy, and the coronavirus has created a lot of work for the government to do, and there will indeed be some legislative work as well, some emergency legislation that is being prepared.
I think we're quite used to the idea in recent years that there are some issues which increasingly are recognised to be cross-departmental, interdepartmental, working on various different topics. But it's quite rare to have one that seems to encompass, or at least touch upon, literally every single chair around the cabinet table.
That's right. It does have an effect in so many departments. Obviously, issues surrounding business, which the budget touched upon, but gives a responsibility for BEIS, effects happening in other countries, so responsibilities for the Foreign Office, responsibilities that relate to the Home Office. Primarily, it's the Health Department that is responsible, but yes, it touches on almost the whole of our system.
And in terms of that collective feeling, that obviously collective responsibility, literally, in terms of the government's response, is it right to say the feeling right now is a moment where the government has to hold its nerve? That's part of what's involved. The pressure's been rather mounting in recent days, a lot of questions being asked about different aspects of policy.
Well, I think the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary set out very clearly at the very beginning that they would be following the scientific and the medical advice. And that clearly has been the right thing to do, because that is pointing the country in the direction in which it ought to go based on evidence rather than on emotion. And we've seen how impressive the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor have been in the presentations that they've made. And that's been very important in maintaining public confidence.
And in terms of political confidence, I know some of your colleagues across the House will have been getting more questions from constituents about this kind of stuff, or questions from the media. How does the government go about maintaining political confidence?
Well, I think people want to know what to do, and the advice to wash your hands remains crucially important. That is one of the best ways of stopping the disease spreading, and opinion polling shows that people have been taking notice of that advice, but other stages of advice are coming in. So crucially, anyone now who has a fever or a persistent new cough should self-isolate for 7 days. And I think people are doing that. I understand that anecdotally people are doing that, and that's very reassuring that the advice is being followed, and that will help slow down the spread of this disease.
And this is a slightly unusual moment in British politics, isn't it? Because you have an issue of huge public interest and understandable public concern, an issue of massive responsibility for the government and for public bodies. And in a sense, you have a melding of political decisions with medical and scientific decisions and advice. Do you think has it been made harder by the furore in recent years about the question of experts, that status of experts in British politics?
No, I don't think it has, because I think you're dealing with fundamentally different types of expertise. That scientific evidence is much better based than economic theories and nostrums that are always coloured by people's political opinions. Whereas with the evidence we're dealing with now, there's no question of any political interest in guiding the evidence one way or another. It is just a straightforward scientific evaluation of what is going on. And that's the key to this current situation and understanding the policies that the government is following. But I also think you see that in public confidence in the decision-making, that people seem to understand that the decision-making is being made in this thoughtful and deliberative way, and have a lot of confidence in that. And it's also being done in a cross-party way. It's very interesting to see that the devolved governments, which aren't all of the same political colour as the government, are working together as the four nations to try and make sure that everyone's doing the right thing. I think there is a genuine national effort taking place, crossing political boundaries based on the scientific and medical evidence. And I think that's really very important. And it's fundamentally different from people plucking an expert from here or there to suit their political convenience.
But it's fair to say there's differences of scientific opinion, I mean, including between the UK and some of our even close neighbouring countries.
I'm not sure how much there's a difference in scientific opinion, or as to how much there is a difference in what people have decided to do and the stages of which they've decided to do it, and the political realities within the countries where they are deciding to do things. That what China can do is different from what the United Kingdom can do.
Is there, in terms of one thing you mentioned a moment ago, is a cross-party cooperation or cross-party debate and disagreement? Obviously, as in your role, you have a particular eye on that, something you're particularly involved with. Obviously, we're working across the House, and with people on, say, the opposition front bench, or with, say, Piers Morgan on national television or Twitter, what's the balance to strike in terms of question and scrutiny, opposition, or dissent, or frankly being difficult? And are they striking it correctly?
The usual role of the opposition, as Disraeli said, is to oppose. That is how our system works. I think when you have a national emergency of this kind, it's a different responsibility. It is to try and help improve decision-making by raising the pertinent questions, trying to help, in that vogue phrase, avoid groupthink. And I think that's a genuine role for the opposition and for commentators to say, are you sure? And I think if you look back at the coalition government in the Second World War, that you have the Labour Party coming together with the Conservative Party in the national interest, but you don't stop questioning how things are being done, because if you just accept everything at face value, you don't necessarily raise the key questions that need to be raised.
And is that balance being struck correctly at the moment?
I think at the moment the contribution being made by the opposition is a serious and well-informed one. And
Piers Morgan?
I don't always follow what Piers Morgan has to say, which, forgive me, is rather embarrassing because I think rather highly of him, but I haven't seen what he's been saying recently.
In terms of that question of the actual functioning of the Commons and functioning of Parliament, one of those questions that's been raised is, should Parliament close? Ought it to close? If it ought to close, when ought it to close? Or how ought it to moderate and alter its own running?
Well, Parliament has taken some steps already to reduce the number of visitors, particularly on the commercial side, which is a very large number of the visitors to Parliament. So it's going along with what the government is advising in lockstep with the scientific advice. And I think that's important, that Parliament should follow what the rest of the country is doing. We should share in the experience of our electors rather than thinking of ourselves as a special case. But there is an extent to which Parliament is a special case, and that is that there will be legislation that is needed. We will need emergency legislation to be passed to ensure the powers are available to help deal with this crisis, and that requires Parliament to be sitting. We will at some point need to pass a finance bill. So there are functions of Parliament that are requirements of our constitutional system, and therefore Parliament needs to be around to do those. What it does in terms of meetings within Parliament, non-essential activities, is a matter where Parliament will follow the rest of the country and the advice that is being given by its central government.
If, as seems to be the case, a growing element of scientific and medical opinion is that, well, obviously we know this is officially a pandemic. There's a high possibility that this disease will become endemic. Nobody knows quite how long it will rumble on for. Some of that will be subject to whether people wash their hands and follow the advice. But we've already seen a certain number of MPs, some MPs diagnosed, other MPs in self-isolation. That potentially could rise, or at minimum it could continue as a rumbling factor. Is there anything the Commons can do to ensure that those MPs and their constituents aren't excluded from, firstly, debate, and secondly, decision making? Can they vote remotely? Can they contribute to the discussion?
I think the pairing system will provide very well for any MPs who are self-isolating. And the desire of parties to work together will be important. It's interesting to see that the Labour Party's gone down to one-line whip this week, which for the votes on the budget is extremely unusual and would imply that they are not intending to hold votes on the budget resolutions. So parties and individuals can decide to do things that they feel are in society's interests without having to be told to do so. And I tend to think that as long as you can, it is better to work with the grain and with people doing things of their own volition rather than forcing things upon people, and allow systems to evolve rather than introducing things that force people to say why they're away from Parliament. Because some people will be very open about their health situation. Other people, for very good reasons, will want those health situations to be confidential. And if you have a system that goes beyond pairing and says, well, you can vote by proxy or something, that undermines patient confidentiality. And therefore, I think there are risks to going down that route.
And at what point does this become a challenge to the non-Westminster work of members of Parliament? You know, of all the people I can think of, members of Parliament must be among those who meet the most people from the widest range of walks of life, communities, age groups, and so on. Obviously, people in their constituencies, they're holding surgeries. To what extent can that realistically be sustained?
I think we need to follow the advice that the government is giving and then apply it to our own personal circumstances. So I did not see my mother on her birthday last Friday because it was her 81st birthday. And
Happy birthday to her.
Thank you very much. And as I meet, as you quite rightly say, a very large number of people, it seemed to me a better idea that she should see my other siblings who aren't meeting hundreds of people in the course of a week. And it's just about thinking through as an individual the risk, listening to the government advice. In terms of surgeries, I have said, or I'm in the process of saying to people booked in to see me, that if they would prefer to do it by telephone, I will make that available to them. So it'll be up to them. They can still come and see me if they want to. But if they think they would rather do it from home rather than being deprived of the constituency surgery appointment, it can be replaced by a telephone call. And I'm sure other MPs are doing similar things to facilitate the work. A lot of work MPs do is done by correspondence rather than face-to-face meetings. And indeed, face-to-face meetings often lead to correspondence. And all of that can continue as normal.
And you mentioned, obviously, following the official advice, understandably. One of the things the government has now signalled in recent days is that coming down the line is a point at which people, particularly those over 70, might well be asked and encouraged to stay within their home and to isolate. Obviously, there are members of Parliament who fall into that age group. I can think of the father of the house, not least. Does that come a point at which the institution has to start to accommodate that? Or would the expectation be that their public role means they ought to make it be an exception?
Well, you rather caught me out there. I've known Peter Bottomley for such a long time, as he and his wife have been friends with my parents forever. But I've always thought of him as he's much younger than my father, as a rather young man, and you're now telling me that he's not. I think MPs will be aware of the national advice, and peers, of course, will be aware of the national advice, and they will need to consider and evaluate that carefully for themselves. But I think, again, that can be dealt with through the pairing system, particularly in the House of Commons. In the House of Lords, they don't have a pairing system, but they have very effective usual channels where the parties manage to work with each other because of nobody having overall control. So these are issues that can be dealt with. They are novel challenges for Parliament, that's absolutely true, but they're not the most complex ones, I don't think. I think that the bigger issue is going to be getting the generality of policy right, in the Prime Minister's term, squashing the sombrero, so that society at large can cope, and so that the availability of medical care is proportionate to the need throughout the crisis. And I think that is the driving aim of government policy.
You've foreseen what was going to be my last question on that particular theme, which is the House of Lords, where over 50%. I think the average age of the House of Lords at last count was 70. So that's something where it becomes. Are you in? Obviously, it's not your personal responsibility. Are you in conversation with the Lords authorities on that question?
The leader of the Lords and the leader of the Commons work very closely together, but I don't have any formal role in that. But the leadership of the House of Lords is highly competent, and I'm sure the parties will work together because they're not unaware of this issue.
In terms of what Parliament or the government is going to be actually doing in terms of forthcoming legislation and so on, obviously emergency legislation, potential introduction of powers is one thing you've mentioned. Are you able to give us some view as to what your work is like at the moment on that?
Well, the issue with emergency powers is working out what powers would be essential, how they would be used, and what time frame you should have for them, because they are by their nature emergency and ought at some point to expire, and working closely with the opposition because emergency legislation needs to be cross-party legislation. That's very important, and all of that is happening. What is my role in this? Well, as leader of the House, you're always both representing the government to the House and the House to the government. So it's ensuring that what is being asked for really is necessary, will be useful, and proportionate, but being as helpful as possible to ensure that any necessary emergency laws are pushed through.
And by the sound of it, one of your working assumptions is that sunset clauses are a term in order to automatically time limit some of these powers. That's something you'd be working from a starting point.
That has been an assumption before it even came to me. That was always the working assumption coming from the Department of Health. They weren't asking for powers forever. And
where does all this leave the question of finance bills and obviously the work after the budget? This is obviously a very unusual position for any budget to be announced in, and we're now going into all these extra complexities. What's the state of play on that front?
Well, the finance bill is normally introduced fairly shortly after the budget, though that would probably be after the Easter recess. It has to be passed by the middle of August to ensure the continuation of things like income tax, which is an annual tax that needs renewing. So that is work that Parliament will have to do, and it will have to work out a means of doing it if other things are happening in the country at large. But we'll follow exactly what the rest of the country is doing, rather than thinking that we should take measures that other people aren't taking.
And aside from the impact of coronavirus on the budget, the understandable decision of the Chancellor and the government to announce specific measures targeted at contingency and protection measures, it's fair to say there was a shift in that budget in quite a fundamental way away from the type of small c conservative fiscal policy which you previously had been quite attached to.
Well, I think there's a division between capital expenditure and current expenditure. That current expenditure is being kept under control. They're recognising that after an extended period of austerity, you can't carry on with that forever, and that there are some areas that are under great pressure. So more money is going to local councils for social care, police have clearly been under pressure, and health service funding is being significantly increased. But beyond that, the government is continuing to ensure that money is well spent and is looking for departments to make efficiency savings, and in the terminology that was used by the Prime Minister, to slaughter sacred cows, so not to carry on doing things just because they've always done them before. So that's important in terms of the good management of day-to-day economic activity. There's then a recognition that infrastructure has a very significant economic reward. There's very strong evidence going back decades on the economic impact of new roads, for example. And anyone driving around this country notices that our road system is very heavily congested, and that has an economic cost. The question is, does the £27 billion road building programme produce an economic return? Would you do it if you were a private company? To which the answer is almost certainly yes, because of the boost it would give to economic growth. The same applies to the rollout of broadband. And in rural constituencies like mine, connecting people digitally opens up all sorts of business opportunities for them, for the overall growth of the economy, which wouldn't otherwise be there. So there is an argument for recognizing that because spending on infrastructure has been held back because of the overall economic situation, now is the right time to tweak it upwards.
But the deficit's going to rise quite sizably, is it not?
The deficit will not fall as swiftly as expected, I think, is a better way of putting it. And the truth is that the government has got, basically 10 years of conservative rule, has got the public finances under control, and therefore what is being proposed is affordable. And the country is economically very well placed, or fiscally very well placed, to deal with an economic shock, which may be the result of the coronavirus. So I think what the work that's been done over the last 10 years has prepared us as well as you could hope for.
I can think back to the last couple of years of Gordon Brown's time as Prime Minister, when the Conservative, perhaps belatedly, the Conservative criticism of him was twofold. It was that he hadn't fixed the roof while the sun was shining. He hadn't got, when economic times were good, he hadn't got into surplus and balanced the books or got into surplus. And the second was that he used to monkey with what counted as being capital expenditure or day-to-day expenditure. He used to redefine these rules in such a way that basically anything counted as investment, which he seemed to spell spending. Has the Conservative Party just adopted Brownonomics? Is that what
I very carefully avoid the word investment when I'm talking about government expenditure. Government almost never invests. The Commonwealth Development Corporation is probably the one example of investment because it actually expects a financial return. Government spends money which may or may not have a beneficial economic consequence. And that's different in its nature from investment. So I avoid the Brownite terminology. But what Gordon Brown did was create a deficit of £150 billion. That's not where we're starting from. We've brought it back under control. There are things that the government should do. The government should do things which individuals can't do for themselves. Individuals cannot, for themselves, widen the M4. And so, I can't go out there with a shovel and dig a sort of bit of extra lane, can I? And you can't join me and make it a bit longer. So governments have a role there, and that is economically beneficial. And we have a clear problem with productivity. And what is underlying that productivity? Well, part of it, though not all of it, is infrastructure obstacles, blockages. And if those can be removed, then we may be able to get our productivity levels up. There are other things, and it's a very interesting conversation. I think our immigration reforms may well help productivity as well, another important part of that.
And finally, do you think there are some aspects of this current crisis, the way in which we're all naturally changing the way we go about our lives, that are potentially going to have longer-lasting effects on questions like productivity? Are there changes that might happen in a gradual way in the economy or in the way the state works that might happen it might be accelerated simply out of necessity?
Well, I think you're raising a very interesting question about globalization and what effects will it have on this, and does the government's call for for companies to divert their manufacturing to produce ventilators indicate a shift in policy towards more domestic manufacturing? And I think there are a combination of factors coming together that have made more reshoring likely. What has caused that? Well, partly the growth in China has meant that China is no longer as extremely cost-effective as it was. Partly the realization with the crisis that dependency on supplies from far afield means that there is an interest in having some supply domestically so that you don't have stoppages in production. But economic nationalism leads to economic failure rather than to economic success. So this needs to be looked at whether there is a good economic case for it, not done as a long-term reaction to a short-term problem.
And on that note, opening all sorts of extra topics for us to discuss next time, I suspect, we are out of time. So, Jacob, a pleasure as always. Lovely to see you, and I'll hopefully see you soon.
Thank you very much. We'll have to get my sister back on, because you did a very good interview with her.
Yes, we did a special episode, didn't you? We should do another,
episode.
try and do another one of those soon.
Yes. Now she's back in the Tory party.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.